Welcome back, everybody, to the last in the series of our Mass Timber Office Forum. Today's panel, we've got a stellar lineup for you, is on architecture and design. Hopefully, with the pubs opening yesterday, you're all not nursing any hangovers and are awake. We decided that we'll move our poll questions towards the end of the session, so you don't have to think too hard to start with. So here's our agenda. My name is Matt Holman. I'm a partner at G&T within the project management business. I'm ably assisted by Oliver Booth, who's also a partner in our QS division. The agenda here is quite simple. We're going to get straight into questions and answers following some introductions of our panelists by Ollie. We have got a couple of poll questions to throw in, and we'll put them in towards the end, as I mentioned just now. So, Ollie, would you like to introduce our panelists, please?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us this morning for our final session of the Mass Timber Commercial Office Forum series. And having heard from many of the core stakeholder disciplines, we felt it fitting to finish by hearing from our architects. The architects have been and are one of the most passionate and informed disciplines on mass timber commercial office projects. And today we shall hear from 6 of the most knowledgeable, internationally renowned architectural practices in the form of AHMM, Arup, Big, Hawkins Brown, War Thistleton, and 3XN. This morning we'll discuss the opportunities and challenges of working with mass timber, key considerations, and the importance of collaboration with other specialists. We'll also discuss practical application and, of course, sustainability, health and well-being, which has been such a common theme throughout the series. And our architects on the panel today from their respective practices are: Paul Monaghan is co-founder of Alford, Hall, Monaghan Morris, fondly known as AHMM. Paul co-founded the architecture practice AHMM in 1989. Paul led AHMM's work on the Reba Stirling Prize-winning Burntwood School in South London, 2015, as well as 2 other Stirling shortlisted buildings in Westminster Abbey Academy, even 2008, and Kentish Town Health Centre in 2009. Recent projects include Richmond House, a new temporary House of Commons chamber, redevelopment of Television Centre in White City, the reimagining of Broadgate for British Land, as well as the reinvention of Liverpool's Royal Court Theatre. Next, we turn to Nick Jackson. He's the director within Arup's Architecture Group and leads the team's work within the London commercial and workplace sectors. Arup Architecture's experience of mass timber dates back to the pioneering project Believe in Better Building for Sky, the first multi-storey timber commercial office in the UK. The flexible open plan building for working and training utilised a glulam and CLT structure and was taken from briefing to practical completion in less than 12 months. Nick is currently working on a number of new build and refurbishment schemes where mass timber is being considered as part of the overall architectural approach. And so to Andy Young, who joined Big in 2016 as technical director of the London office. Prior to joining Big, Andy was an associate partner at Roger Stirk Harbours and Partners and was the architect in charge of delivering the Leadenhall building, seeing the project from planning to completion in 2014. Andy has over 25 years of experience in the design and construction of large-scale projects in the UK and the Middle East. In addition to the UK role, he provides technical assistance to the Copenhagen and New York offices. Since 2016, Andy has led some of Big's most prominent projects, including East Side Tower, an 80,000 square metre mixed-use tower in Berlin. Andy has also led the technical design for the Google's new King's Cross headquarters, which is featured many times because of its use of CLT in the forum, and City Life Milan projects. Roger Hawkins founded Hawkins Brown with Russell Brown in 1988. In 2017, he was appointed to provide guidance to the Greater London Authority as Mayor's design advocate. Roger is actively involved in projects across all studios at Hawkins Brown, promoting cross-pollination of sector intelligence through key projects such as Here East, the Beecroft building at Oxford University, and Crossrail. Alongside that studio practice, Roger regularly lectures at architectural schools and conferences, as well as write for Architectural Press. He is currently a practice professor at the University of Sheffield. And Wenlock Road, also known as the Cube, is one of the notable examples of Hawkins Brown experience of working with mass timber. Next to Andrew War, he is director and co-founder of War Thistleton Architects. War Thistleton have completed more than 25 mass timber buildings in the UK and beyond. They are currently designing and constructing over 100,000 square metres of timber office buildings with projects in London, Milan, Amsterdam and the US. Notable completed mass timber projects include Murray Grove, the world's first tall timber building in 2008, Dalston Works, Vitso and 6 Oarsman Road. The practice continued to be known for their wide-ranging research in sustainable construction, for which Andrew won the RIBA's President's Medal and was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize. And finally, but no mean least, is Arden Oakdale, who is a senior partner and head of design at 3XN. Arden joined 3XN in 2008 and since gained solid experience as well as international recognition for designing complex projects which target ambitious sustainability goals. Arden is currently leading the design for the world's largest fish market in Sydney Fish Market and the Quay Quarter Tower, which is under construction in Sydney, both fundamentally targeting Australia's highest sustainability standard. Arden's ongoing projects include T3 Bayside in Toronto, which will be North America's tallest timber building and is certainly worth having a look at, as well as 2 Finsbury Avenue at Broadgate in central London, a new 36-storey development targeting net zero carbon in construction and operations, setting new standards to high-rise, embodied carbon and carbon transparency. And as always, the G&T team would just like to thank all of our panelists for freely giving us their time and contributing to today's forum. And so that is today's panel. Matt, back over to you.
Great, thanks, Ollie. That's fantastic. Welcome, panelists. Really good to have you on board. Really is a stellar lineup, so that's great to have you all here. Just for our audience, we've split the session into opportunities and challenges, key considerations. We'll touch on collaboration and application. Naturally, we'll touch on sustainability and wellbeing, standards, regulations and testing. We'll cast an eye overseas again, as we normally do, and look at some international bits and bobs, and we'll cast an eye to the future as well. So with no further ado, let's get straight into the questions. And don't forget to use your chat function for any questions you may have as an audience member. We can weave those in as we go if appropriate, or we might pick them up at the end, or failing all of that, we'll pick them up in our summary report as we usually do. So here we go, let's get going. So opportunities and challenges. What, in your experience, are the opportunities for using mass timber for commercial offices? Let's go to Auden and to Nick on that first question. Who wants to go first?
I can go first maybe. And good morning, everyone. Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities, and I guess to me, what is interesting with timber is that it creates kind of a visible link between the end user and a sustainable building, and I think that's why it has a lot of kind of focus at the moment. You know, from cities looking for circular projects to tenants that demand kind of environmental friendly buildings, and I think timber has the opportunity to directly connect the material to the end user, and I think that's the biggest opportunity it has, because it adds value, not only performance based in terms of carbon, but also actually in terms of the experience of the user.
Great. Nick?
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely true. That sort of empathy and sort of engagement you get with the material is very different from what you find with concrete or steel. But I think allied to that, really, that the carbon impact of it is central to why we're all looking at it in terms of where the industry is moving as the grid cleans up. The importance of embodied carbon is becoming more central. I think the other things it offers, though, is, as we found at Sky, is speed. What you can do with large panels, because of the weight, you can put things together very quickly. Obviously, the prefabrication is really interesting, and we're seeing increasingly the opportunity to use it in hybrid structures where weight allied to other materials, maybe to increase the span if you need to, allows you to do things in retrofit and refurbishment that you might not do with conventional materials with the same sort of positive impact.
Yeah, that hybrid piece is a piece that Ollie and I have found have come right through this panel, all the sessions, the move towards hybrid. Okay, that's great. Thanks for that, both of you. So are there benefits to mass timber offices for tenants over other more traditionally built spaces? We touched on that just briefly just then, but Paul and Andy, would you like to just touch on that?
Yeah, certainly. Actually, Nick's point is a really good one. I mean, I think one of the main benefits for tenants is the ability to make cutouts in floors where sort of roughly wherever you can quite easily, which was always more problematic when you're designing sort of concrete or steel building, where you're trying to allow a few areas where you can make openings, but it's never particularly where the client wants it in the end. So I think that's one of the big benefits. I mean, I think And again, what Auden said, I think is what we're finding with certainly our work with British Land. Tenants want outstanding BREEAM buildings now. They do not want anything else. Anyone who's building one that's of a lower standard is going to struggle. And that's because tenants want those buildings. It's the young tenants who are coming in. It's the way people are more activated. And I think the fact that CLT has that visual aspect as well as the environmental aspect that I think is why it's becoming so incredibly popular.
Andy, anything to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I think that the whole kind of timber thing is very evocative of the kind of 21st century outlook. So, you know, tenants, assuming that they're big commercial tenants, are often putting a lot of emphasis on, you know, looking outwards, how responsible they are as a company. And I think that timber is kind of seen in this sort of subjective way that I think some of the other guys have just explained, that it's a kind of, it's a responsible material, but I mean, it's also something that makes people feel like it's just a generally a nice place to be. Like, as in stark contrast to say a 20th century outlook of a steel and glass tower for a commercial occupier was about, you know, humankind's sort of conquest over nature, whereas in the 21st century we seem to be kind of tending towards a more kind of harmonious story that organizations want to show that they're kind of much more in harmony with nature now, and also to be kind to the tenants and the occupiers, insofar as, you know, that timber's seen as something which is a very nice and pleasant material to be around, and it's less likely to be painted with some kind of gooey incandescent paint like steel would be, and so on. So I think that there's a general, it's kind of humans have an affinity to nature, and that is now making its way into the corporate world with all this corporate responsibility business, which is kind of at the top of everybody's agenda. And obviously, yes, it does speak very clearly about a kind of responsible attitude to environmental performance of buildings and fit outs.
Cheers, Andy. I don't know if you can hear, I'm very close to nature. I've got a bird's nest in the chimney right next to me, so you can hear birds. They're just being fed by their mum and dad, so apologies, I can't do much about that. Next one, to Andrew and to Roger, are there any disadvantages of using mass timber over other solutions? Andrew, do you want to pick that up first?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. There are absolutely disadvantages. I mean, I think it's, you know, it's the same with many things, is that the advantages bring some disadvantages. So the lightweight nature of the material means that perhaps it doesn't have the strength of concrete and steel, but it has the opportunities for prefabrication, for quick installation. But that lightweight means that it perhaps doesn't kind of get to the spans that we look for in concrete and steel buildings. And, you know, you're using something new. So that changes everything. You know, we've been building in concrete and steel for 100 years, so we know what we're doing there. So that I think the principal disadvantage really is really having to learn a whole new way of building.
Roger?
Well, we're big fans of using both glulam and CLT, but I think there's a couple of things you've got to watch out for. One of them I would say is maintenance. You know, water ingress is often a problem in all buildings, but in a traditional building, you often see that manifest itself with a drip, and so you get a bucket and then you get the maintenance man in to repair it. But in a CLT building, it's a bit like building in Weetabix. It can soak up that water, and you could have a sort of inbuilt problem that you're not necessarily aware of. So I think water ingress and maintenance is a key issue. And another one is decoration. You know, we've had a few instances. You know, we've been using this material for 30 years, and it can look a bit tired. We had a problem in a boarding house at an independent school where all the pupils were rubbing their chairs up against the back of the back of the building, and it was gouging a line in the CLT. I might add, we didn't specify those chairs, and it probably would have happened if it was plasterboard anyway, but it became an issue about how that was going to be repaired. So just general maintenance issues, you need to keep an eye out for that. And fire, but I think Andrew's going to come on and talk about fire, so I'll leave that to him, the expert.
Thanks, Roger. Okay, so yeah, the key considerations then. So what are the key considerations from an architectural perspective for designing a mass timber? Andrew, if you want to pick that one up first. You're on mute, Andrew.
Oh, classic. I think the key considerations are, you know, that firstly, it's about kind of, I think, the design process, and that design process, as I was saying before, because it's a brand new way of building, that design process needs to be truly collaborative. So, you know, your design team need to have that kind of, you know, that sort of method of working, that intent. I think kind of early engagement with all the regulatory authorities is absolutely imperative. So talking to insurers, talking to fire engineers, right from the very beginning. So, but really the kind of, you know, that sort of, the key consideration has to be around that level of collaboration, I think.
Paul?
Yeah, well, I'd suppose from a design point of view, so spans, as Andrew touched on before, spans in office buildings have been getting bigger and bigger recently, you know, going to 9, sometimes 10, even a bit more, and having column-free spaces is a big part of it. Now, that's like the last 10 years. I think there is a mood with companies like Google and other tech companies where they're not so bothered about those big spans anymore, and they're quite happy to have, I suppose, kookier types of space. But swing spans are definitely something one needs to look at. Although it's very long in one direction, it has to be shorter in the other. So you sometimes are at 6 meters if you're using purer stuff. And so I think that's the one thing. I think the other is definitely fire. I mean, we've recently did a building for a major client where it was, I wasn't about to go on site, but it had been tendered. Building regs were happy with it. Local authority were happy with it. London Fire Brigade not happy with it at all. And it had to be redesigned to a steel composite structure. With no CLT. And I think, I believe, and I think Andrew might know more about this, the fire brigade are now talking about how they effectively, that a building needs to be performed well after a fire. So when they go in to look at the building, that the building is still in good condition. Now that is a whole new world of building regs that didn't exist before. And that's definitely holding things up. And you know, we're not talking about housing today, but on housing, obviously there's a government consultation going on at the moment, and I think there's an awful lot of people very keen for that to come out in the right way. But I think they're the considerations.
Okay, cool. I mean, we've touched on fire insurance in previous panels, obviously, and I think the competence piece is one that we've touched on in previous panels as well. But just from your experience, Nick, who are the key team specialists you need on your mass timber projects, just to do the PM bit?
Well, I think as Andrew's touched on, it's a very different way of making a building. So you've got to start right from the outset with the right people in the team. You can't get halfway through a concept just with your architect and then decide to go, right, well, how are we going to turn this into a timber building? You know, the opportunities begin with looking at the ground and foundations with new buildings. So, you know, you need to be looking hard at engineered. Paul's referred to how critical grid is. You know, it's a different arrangement of building. If you're working in the world of retrofit, then clearly you've got to understand the structure you're working with, and you're playing the sort of game of pinching load from one building, moving it into the other. And all of that stuff has to happen in the sort of right at the briefing stage and really thinking about it to make sure that the design of the building is in tune with actually what the client and the future tenants might want. You know, I mean, okay, if you're in the middle of the city, you might need long span, but actually for a lot of occupiers, long span isn't such a crucial thing. But you've really got to embrace those sort of parameters right at the outset and not get halfway through and go, oh, now what are we going to do with the materiality? So, you know, like most good projects, you've got to have the team there from the outset. But as Andrew said, you've really got to embrace it and understand what you're working with.
So basically, experience is a key.
Yeah, and then you've got to work through that from a program cost point of view. Those are all different, and you've got to have everybody, the other disciplines, all on board with it. Otherwise, you just, you know, the spanners come out later on, really.
Okay, thank you. So moving on to application then. What are the main applications of mass timber you're seeing in your practice? If we touch on that with Roger first. Roger?
Thanks, Matt. I mean, Hawkins Brown has been around for 30 years, and 30 years ago we were doing it for quite small buildings. We did play arc, play barn, play cabin, play den for the London Borough of Newham. We worked through the alphabet on sort of buildings for young children, and we used it on schools and individual houses. But as you know, it's become more mainstream as we've become working on more mainstream projects. So I think for the past several years we've been using it for universities. They tend to be a bit more, you know, so owner occupier and thinking very carefully about the sort of space that they need and cost efficiency and time, etc. But at the moment we're seeing major clients, Argent, British Land, Delancey, where we're working at Earl's Court at the moment, you know, all exploring the use of timber, and it is becoming absolutely mainstream as a sort of go-to project. But often, as you were saying, Matt, I think a hybrid solution. You know, we're finding using mass timber for flooring, maybe steel or concrete for the main structures is quite a common solution.
That's interesting. Andy, anything to add?
Yeah, exactly. Or just what Roger said exactly on that on this hybrid business. Obviously, a good example from us is the Google project, which is a steel structure with CLT floors. Incidentally, the floors that are not part of the fire compartmentation are CLT. Obviously, Google, there's a bit of a unusual scenario there with 10-metre high mullions made in timber. We're also just we've got another job in Italy at the moment, gigantic commercial office building with a huge timber roof right over the top of it, and that was originally conceived as a concrete shell. But as we've got into the project, we're now doing that in timber. It's actually got steel tendons inside it in the same way that concrete would. Yeah, so there's all kinds of stuff that's happening at the moment. It's turning into a genuine alternative, particularly for roof structures, I think, because you know, the roof structure typically doesn't have to be fire rated, but also there's if you're into doing some kind of quite expressive architecture, there's always the soffit of the roof to think of as well. So yeah, all over the place now. It's catching on, that's for sure.
Cheers, Andy. Paul?
Yeah, I suppose just like Roger, I think our early work about 25 years ago was schools, the roofs of primary schools. We used to use it and realised it was very flexible. Our first bigger use of it was with Lendlease, where they went through a period of really experimenting with CLT on housing. We did a project in Battersea where, you know, it was almost entirely CLT with a little bit of steel in. And then we built 2 houses that were carbon zero next to it where they were exposed to. And I suppose then in terms of commercial work, just like Andy, it was Google originally where we developed this timber floor, CLT floor, which was quite different at the time. And then carried on looking at, within their fit outs, the idea of a kit of parts for meeting rooms. More recently, I think we've, just like Roger, there's 2 versions, concrete frame with CLT infill, steel frame with CLT infill. And I suppose the one I'm looking after at the moment that seems the most pioneering from our point of view is above Southwark Tube Station for Transport for London. And that is, it really shows the benefits because the tube station wasn't designed to have a big building on it. So CLT is very light, and that allows us to touch the ground reasonably lightly for a big building.
Great, fantastic. So moving on to finish, and what level of finish do you look for on your projects, Auden? If you wouldn't mind just explaining that in a bit more detail. Just, you're on mute. That's it. Cool.
Okay, can you hear me right now?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Well, I think finish is an interesting question because, you know, I was born in Norway. And in Norway, every single house is more or less timber, at least the cottages, you know, exterior and interior, 100%. So I kind of grew up in a 100% timber environment. And for me, the solution is not to do timber everywhere. You know, I think in terms of the look of it, you know, today we're discussing maybe more in terms of using it for structural reasons. And there it would obviously be to expose it, but it also matters what kind of timber you use. You know, in Toronto, for example, we're working with nail laminated timber, which has much more texture to it. And, you know, there's even dowel laminated timber. There's a lot of different types of timber you could use for these structural slabs, for example. And so I think obviously exposing it because it's a natural material. I think there's a lot of value in that. Puts a lot of pressure on the MEP and everyone coming together to make sure that that is kind of tidy and nice system. And I think there's been quite a few points about warranties and durability. We've used timber on a few projects on the exterior. The arena here in Copenhagen, for example. There we did I think 4 different mock-ups, testing on site how it weathered during the first couple of years. And so weathering, I think, is a crucial thing if you're using timber on exterior, making sure that it will last and stay nice. So I think it's a material that needs to be taken seriously. And I actually have one point there. It's a good thing when we're working with timber is not to say, we do a building and then at some point we look at, can it be concrete or steel or timber? I think you need to embrace the timber from the beginning and make a building that is essentially created around that concept. And I think that's how we found it in our project in Toronto that Oliver mentioned in his introduction, that essentially the timber structure was essentially the concept from the beginning. And therefore, it's much actually easier to work with finishes and the look of it because it's part of the concept. So
great.
I think those discussions I would recommend early in the process so we can all get on board and work as hard on the material as possible.
Great, thanks, Alden. We've just had a question in actually from John Curran. Thank you, John. I might just ask this now actually. Earlier, the panelists expressed the importance of expressing wood internally and the empathy it creates with the users. How can you successfully express the structure to those experiencing the building from the outside? Interesting question. Who wants to pick that? Anyone want to pick that one up? Just see if there's anyone.
I can just briefly talk, Matt, about on our Google project. Obviously, a lot of timber on the outside there. It's not actually holding the building up in terms of structure, but it's massive timber sections that are forming the huge cladding panels on that building. And on the outside, you see in that project, you'll see mullion on the inside, gigantic timber block. And on the outside, you see the same thing, but the outside is a thin layer of what's called Accoya timber, which is very kind of resilient material. And we couldn't make the whole thing out of Accoya because it's not available in the UK, so it would have to be shipped from all around, from New Zealand or something to get to the site. So we couldn't do that. But there are ways of making timber elements, and laminating them together and so on, in such a way that you can see them on the outside of the building equally to the inside. That's the only experience I have of that. So that's really all I can say.
Thank you. Anyone else to add? No? Okay. Right. So, Nick, is there an inherent interface with interior fit outs? How do you interface with interior fit outs on mass timber projects? Do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I mean, 2 parts to that. Actually, just to carry on from the question you just had, I mean, the thing you often see when you look from the outside of the building are ceilings and soffits. And both for the interior fit out, but actually from the view from the outside, that edge of the building and what you see when you look up through glass, assuming you're dealing with glass in a way that you maintain a good level of transparency, is often the thing that characterizes the building. So we walk around the City of London, we see the whole collection of SAS ceiling grids. You've got the full suite there. That's the thing you see is ceilings and lighting, once you look through the buildings. So I think as far as fit out goes, clearly, as we've said, the whole, you want the tenant to embrace the spirit and the character of the building you're designing. They need to come on board with that. Obviously, if they come to a building thinking they're going to be able to do what they do with a long span steel building, they're going to find it a different world. They're going to find probably ventilation is coming from the floor, not the ceiling. that's typically how you would move air around. If it's a full mass timber building, there's probably a bit more going on the soffit you need to work with. And then there's the conversation: do you want to see all the wood, or do you want to emphasize it in some places, and other places you may not want to see it? That's, as Auden has said, there might be too much. There's then technical things, acoustics, you've got dynamics to worry about maybe, and as Roger talked about, water, where you've got water going and how you make sure you really, you've got 2 or 3 lines of safety on that is really important, I think, to think about.
Cool, thanks, Nick. Right, hopefully all of our audience are now sobering up from their night at the pub for the first time in God knows how long. So Ollie, do you want to hit them with our first poll question?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So the question is, a very simple yes or no answer, please, everyone, is: are you measuring embodied carbon on your recent current developments? Now, we're kind of hoping this will be an overwhelming yes, but it's interesting to collect the data. We know how dangerous carbon is to our environment. So yes or no, please. Are you measuring embodied carbon on your recent current developments?
You might be accused of leading the witness there, Ollie. Okay, drum roll. Answers in.
Now, 86% said yes, 14% said no. So that is interesting.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, that leads on nicely to our next part of the questions on sustainability and health and wellbeing. So, question for Andrew. Do you believe that mass timber has a role to play in achieving the UK's net zero carbon targets?
Thanks, Matt. Well, following that poll, I think it's, definitely. I mean, it's an essential part of us being able to fulfill those targets. I mean, the amount of carbon emissions that we get from concrete and steel are massive, and we need to be weaning ourselves away from concrete and steel. Obviously, there's still going to be a role for those materials, in foundations, civil engineering, that kind of thing. But I think that our future needs to be a predominantly timber one in order to be able to reach those targets, because those emissions from those building materials, they're the emissions that we're suffering right now. Not 60 years, not over 60 years, but right now. So timber really is it's the only alternative in the sense of a kind of viable structural alternative to concrete and steel, and one that you can just keep growing more of.
Yeah, quite. Thank you. So one for Roger. Roger, have you noticed a change in the key drivers from clients and tenants? And if so, what have these trends been towards? I'm going to pick that one up.
I think the main recent trend is one of health and well-being. Both Paul and Andy mentioned Google, and what's driving them is a war for talent, isn't it? Really, it's attracting and retaining staff. So people like Google and are wanting to sort of make sure that their buildings are attractive and good places to work. But we see it across other sectors. We've just completed a building for Warwick University, which is a research building. And the labs are a relatively traditional concrete frame building, but adjacent to it. So this is hybrid, but a sort of vertical split. We've got a 4-story, completely timber framed area of the building, which is for write-up. And that's specifically they wanted to attract researchers and staff into an area where they were considering health and well-being of the building users, of the tenants. And so that's a key driver that I've seen recently changing. And BCO are also identifying that in guidance that they're putting out for office commercial workspace.
Thank you. So moving on to standards, regulation and testing, a question for Andrew and for Nick. What standards for designing with timber are you aware of, and what more could be done? Bit of a leading question again, but Andrew, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Matt. I think that there are some good guides out there in terms of the Structural Timber Association have written some good guidelines in terms of how to build with timber. I think that we essentially need a lot more research done. The research has to be, I think, fed partly by the design process, by the design problems that we come across, should be feeding into that research. But that research needs to be, specifically around fire and water, and needs to be collaborative, needs to be shared by the industry. if you're talking about kind of guidelines with regard to kind of BCO and that kind of thing, the issues around those is that I think that those guidelines were written with concrete buildings in mind. They were written to suit the kind of buildings that we were building already. So those guidelines are, you know, need to be rethought. They need to be reconsidered, and I think to suit timber buildings, to suit the buildings that we can achieve in timber.
Nick, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, Andrew's completely on it in the sense that, you know, until we get to a place where we don't have the fire brigade pulling the plug on Paul's building at the last minute, you know, because they're not persuaded, and that they can rely on the standards and the testing. So, you know, the fire testing that's going on at the moment is going to be critical to actually enable us all to be able to go out there and design buildings with the confidence, and that clients have the confidence that they can be delivered, and that testing will roll into BSs and so on. You know, the BCO's got it acknowledges timber as one of its, you know, as a material there. It's in there, and sustainability is part of it, but all of that has got to come much further up the agenda on the next writing of it. And you know, clearly the BCO's got a lot to look at in post-pandemic world across the whole sector, but one would like to see carbon, sustainability, timber right at the front of, you know, the next guide, really, in terms of how they're thinking about buildings.
Well, what about the RIBA, Nick? Just to add to that, you know, what I mean, it's be remiss of me not to ask a set of architects about the RIBA's thoughts on all this. What more could they do, Bailey?
Well, they're involved in, you know, the movement that sort of Andrew's obviously been working on around Architects Declare. They've had a strong move on sustainability for a long time, but they've sort of held back, I think, from standards and really trying to promote and recommend. I don't know, Paul may know more about where they're traveling, but I think it's, you know, it's always difficult territory for the RIBA to sort of step forward and start saying you should do this and you shouldn't do that. It's never been their way, I think, really.
Fair enough. Okay, Ollie, do you want to pick up on our second and last poll question?
Yes, please, Matt. Okay, coming up now. Hopefully. Okay, in your experience, have you found planning officers' attitudes to be different towards mass timber, hybrid mass timber projects during the planning process? And this is one of 4 answers, please. Yes, they are more supportive. Yes, they are less supportive. No, I've seen no difference whatsoever. Or there's an option to abstain on this one. I'm sure probably all the guys on this morning, Matt, will probably be well placed to give us a view on that. But it'd just be really interesting to see how the planners respond to timber buildings, mass timber buildings.
Everyone answer that.
The answer's just coming up now.
Oh, well done.
Okay, so that's you know, 38% said yes, they are more supportive, which is really encouraging. 3% said they are less supportive. 28% have seen no difference, which is a little bit disappointing, and 31% abstainers.
Cool, thanks, Ollie. Great. I seem to have lost my questions, so I'll just go down. I've got them now. That's cool. Okay. Right, so that leading on from that then, so what has been your experience with planning officers on mass timber and hybrid mass timber projects, and have you found there to be a difference in their attitudes towards mass timber developments? Let's ask Andy that one first.
Well, look, we are talking to officers about projects with hybrid timber and so on. I wouldn't say that it's specifically in my experience, it's not something that means that you get an easy ride through planning. No one's going to chairlift you out of the room for using timber in the building, in my experience. The thing with planners is that they tend to bank everything that comes their way and then concentrate on all the other stuff. And I don't think really that it's a massive help through the planning process in general. However, I will say that our experience with Camden was probably made a little bit easier through having timber on the outside of the building, for probably the reason that very connected to the chat question and some of the earlier stuff, which is kind of what's in it for the public. Are we just going to look at another crummy, gigantic, absolutely gigantic office building that's completely private and the public can't go into it, or are we going to get something special? And the answer is, well, you get something that's very different from what you're used to, and timber figures in that. And I think that was probably kind of something that was helpful. But I think strategically, just going in, I mean, you're not going to have any luck at all going to the local planning authority and saying, well, look, all these timber columns in the building are much bigger than the steel ones. And that means we've got to make the building get bigger as well. So it's got just as much space in it. So that's a justification for why I've designed this gigantic building. It's just never going to happen. I think all the usual constraints and requirements, like, you know, townscape views and overall massing of the building and so on, they're all pretty solidly worked out in the planning process. So it may be helpful in certain circumstances, I'd say, but it's not gonna. You're not going to have much luck just playing the environmental excuse card, you know. And they say that'll do nicely, sir. That's not going to happen.
Okay, cheers, Andy. Roger, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think my experience, like Andy, really, but it's also in line with your poll. You know, I think a lot of planning officers, it's not really relevant to them, or even, you know, not applicable to them. So often it's not an issue. Ollie, in his introduction, mentioned Wenlock Cross, which we did a few years ago now in Hackney, and Hackney were very supportive, and actually it became a planning condition that the building was built in timber frame. That's a sort of 10-story residential block, which they were very keen to see promoted. And I guess sustainability is a key argument. We've had other experiences where sensitive sites, often schools building on the edge of Greenbelt or adjacent to you know, posh residential areas, and seeing timber frame there is often a sort of slight softening of the building. But I'm not convinced planners really get that involved in the choice of construction materials in the way they, you know, historically they wouldn't be worried whether it was a steel frame or a concrete frame. You know, there are other more important planning issues. Although sustainability, as the panel's been saying, is increasingly an issue, and you know, we can demonstrate a more carbon appropriate solution by using timber, and everyone should be using HBERT, which is the Hawkins Brown energy reduction tool. When they're developing their designs, it's a plug into Revit, and it'll give you an immediate answer about carbon in your products. And timber frame, using timber generally comes out scoring very well for sustainability.
Great, thanks, Roger. Okay, so what do you think about the current available testing data for mass timber? That's one for Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. There is a lot of testing data available, especially internationally. I think we have a research project at the moment running with the European Union where we're looking across Europe at all the different research data that's available. And there is a lot more data out there than I think is widely understood. However, there's a lot more needed as well. And I think that, you know, as we go forward, I'm sure that you know, there are tests going ahead at the moment. We need to be sharing the results for those. We need to make sure that we all understand, you know, who's paying for those tests as well, to make sure whether they're positive or whether they're negative, you know, or whether they're negative, actually, you know, what the source of that information is. So I think not taking the tests immediately on face value is also important. So we need to be quite discerning, but also encouraging our clients, encouraging others to invest in testing is imperative to take the technology forward.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. There's a good point made by Sam Littrop, actually, and it's not a question, but it's just pointing out that the testing for BCO and LFB is progressing fast. It is the insurance market who are refuting the veracity of the test evidence currently. So while focusing on approvability is the current status quo, more focus needs to go on how insurers' objectives can be demonstrated through testing. We've had a good panel on that before, and indeed Sam was part of our fire and testing panel as well. So a good point. We'll expand on that probably in our report a bit more. Okay, Nick, so just to conclude that sort of standards regulation piece, what do you think can be done in helping breaking down any barriers in terms of regulation?
Well, that's, you know, we live in a world of regulation, you know, as building designers and constructing buildings. The more we can try and get them joined up and talking to each other, I think is crucial thing. And I suppose fundamentally it's getting building regs to move to a point that it's not completely prohibiting in certain places. We're talking about commercial buildings. This is a really challenging conversation at the moment in obviously in residential buildings. But the building regs it's moved a long way in the last 20 years around energy and Part L. It's got to do the same thing now with embodied carbon, as has BREEAM really. And somehow we've got to join up the approach to measuring sustainability and where those benchmarks are. And in the same way, we've got to share testing data. I think we've got to share our research and our measurements, if you like, around buildings. So if 83% of people on this call are measuring carbon in their buildings, that data needs sharing. We need to understand and really see where the opportunity to change the dial is on carbon, really. I mean, that's fundamentally what we're all trying to do, is shift the impact of development and building for long-term sustainability.
Cheers, Nick. Thank you for that. Okay, let's cast our eye across the water. We've done a bit of that at the start, but it reminds us not to, particularly Auden, on to ask if there's any international mass timber projects that we can learn from. So Auden, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think prefabrication was mentioned earlier in this. We're doing, I think, Sydney Fish Market, that's 20,000 square meter roof structure, prefabricated members in Sydney, and a lot of residential projects. We're doing a tower now in Lausanne, which is essentially a mass timber structure, and in Denmark as well. Prefabrication can make a time in terms of structure is lower than all of that stuff. So there's a lot of good learnings there. In terms of commercial projects, I think I mentioned earlier the project in Toronto that we're doing it. And I think one learning that I have taken from that project is that our client on that is Heinz, and they essentially came in with a brief saying this building needs to be a timber building. So they were able to assemble a team already from day one that could kind of lift that kind of job. And it enabled us from all disciplines to essentially make a project that I think is quite unique in a sense, because it's taking timber as a design element, looking at MEP, beam heights, all of that stuff is incorporated into the structure, so it all kind of works. We don't have that kind of complicated solutions that you have to do if you kind of change on a later stage in the project. And it also we didn't have the discussion on spans, because it was there from the beginning. So I think there's a few projects there that I think is worth to look at in terms of production, manufacturing, but also how kind of a design can embrace timber as a concept.
Great, thank you. Paul, any you want to pick out?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of buildings that are being designed at the moment, but not many being finished. I asked Nick Crawley, who's our one of our researchers, architects in the office. And by the way, Nick has just published a book called Cross-Laminated Timber, a design stage primer, which is a really good guide for anyone who doesn't know anything about it, which takes a lot of case studies of a lot of the architects that are here today. And it's published by the RIBA, but literally came out about 2 weeks ago. But I asked Nick that question, which buildings around the world? And North America are getting, starting to become a lot more progressive with that. Their regulations are getting looser. They've always built in timber. But apparently there's a building which I had a look at yesterday, which is Adidas's new headquarters in Portland, which is it's not by architects we'd know, and that, to be honest, the outside of it is fine. But if you look at the structure, it's precast columns and beams with big spans, and then it has composite CLT with glulam underneath, and creates sort of a beam ceiling like I've got here, only without painted MDF in between. But so effectively, but big spans, and it almost looks like an old warehouse. The outside's horrible, but I think have a look at that to people who are here, because I think that looks, it's hard to find built examples of bigger spans and bigger buildings. I'm sure Andy's building will be, the Google thing is going to be, very important in Britain as well.
Andy, any from you want to highlight?
That's kind, Paul. We'll see.
Yeah.
See what it looks like on a rainy day in King's Cross. We'll do the Pepsi challenge with the others in the area, I think. So I would say, I mean, I just have a bit of a favourite that I would like to say is this building by Sana in Connecticut. I'm not even sure what the building is, but it's just a tour de force in terms of just a gorgeous building using timber as a structural material for the roof and for the soffit as well. And it's just a completely sublime piece of work. And I just think that that's the joy of timber in many ways. It's something which, at the one hand, can be incredibly modern and clearly informed by science, and at the same time, it's a natural material. And I think there's a moment that happens in the human mind when you look at something like that. So do your Google searches for Sana, Connecticut, and there's, I suppose we're trying to do something similar with that in the Italian job, a huge commercial project in Milan, and the lessons learned from that is, it's difficult to do anything new with any different materials, but yeah, keep an eye out for that one as well.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, we've got some live questions that's coming. Gary Elliott, hi Gary, has got a good question here. So designing for disassembly is fast becoming a planning requirement, and a number of local authorities are now asking for justification that this has been considered as part of a whole life cycle carbon analysis. What is the experience of the panel on this, and how do they see timber fitting into this? Good question. Who wants to pick that one up first? Any takers? Any waving of arms?
I think I can maybe say one thing, Matt. I think, to me, design for disassembly does not need to be timber. Like we have done a project here in Copenhagen, which uses concrete, for example. So, with mechanical fixing. So I think it doesn't need to be timber in that sense, but obviously timber in the way you would structure it is mechanical fixings. And then in that sense, it would naturally be able to disassemble again. There is this problem about acoustics and pouring concrete on top of it, which makes that a little bit harder. But there's definitely huge potential in terms of tapping into kind of the circular focus with using timber buildings.
Andrew, you were waving just then. Did you want to?
Yeah, it was. No, I think that, absolutely, Audun's completely right. I think one of the things that makes timber that much easier, obviously, is the lightweight nature of the material, and also that you can adapt it as well. So not just disassembly, but also adaptation. In the building that we finished for British Land last year, the brief changed through the building from a regular office building to co-working space, and so we needed to put another staircase in, and that was done, on a 7-story building. That was done within a week or so of, with a chainsaw and some handy carpenters. And we even actually made some of the staircase was made from the floor slab. So that kind of level of adaptability will allow our buildings to last a lot longer as well.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you all. So just cast an eye to.
Roger's got his hand up, Matt.
I was just going to be slightly contentious. I mean, I'm not saying disassembly is a red herring, but I think it's more important to think about designing for assembly than disassembly. I mean, too often people don't do that. If you're designing something, you've got to work out how it's going to be built. And I've spent a few days around Langerook's Explore factory where they are focusing on designing for manufacturing and assembly. And what we do as architects now is create virtual reality, which goes straight to their factory to make things. So you have to be really mindful of designing for assembly and manufacturing, I would argue, as a priority rather than just disassembly. It's a negativity from the planners.
Okay. Thanks, Roger. Okay, so we're going to eye on a future, bit of a free-for-all at the end. How do you see mass timber changing in the next 5 years, say? Who wants to go first on that?
I can go, if you like, Matt. Well, I think we've got to see the outcome of this government report on timber in housing, because it's such an appropriate place to use it, and I think that's something I'd like to see in the future, because I think we should be seeing much more buildings built that way. I think in terms of offices, I think the market, as we've all talked about, the market, the new tenants, they want something greener, they like the look of it. We all know that people want something that's visual when we talk about a sustainable building, even though quite often a lot of the systems we use are hidden away and there's nothing visual. The great benefit, there's solar cells on the roof, but people can't see them. Great thing about timber is you can see it, and it's a sort of softer material. So I think we're going to see a huge increase in that in offices. I really do.
Yeah, can I also say, I think that we'll see timber used in the kind of the flourishy bits of the design much more than we have done in decades past. So, looking backwards, you would always have that kind of spectacular steel spiral stair or whatever, back in the days when everybody was putting on shoulder pads, jumping in the Golf GTI, driving to work, and everything was was all shiny, the steel building with a Larry paint job on it. That's all over now. And I think what will happen is that the elements of the design, which are a bit like a kind of, the bit where it's clearly a flourish in the design and a bit of care has been put on it, which might previously have been, a bridge across the atrium made out of steel and beautifully detailed, will in future we'll see these fancy roof structures and bridges and all the bits that the architects really go to town on. I think timber is going to be a much more widely used feature of the building, and the best bits of the building will increasingly be feature timber as well.
Great.
I think, Matt, what we're talking about this as you've run these forums as it's about innovation. It's essentially it's seen as new material, though we've all said, look, it's hundreds of years old. It's the norm in different parts of the world. I would hope in the next 5 years it permeates the day-to-day of our industry much more, so that when you walk into a room, say, look, we think we'd like to do this in timber, we're down in South Wales with the structure, people don't fall off their chair and go, no, all we can do is steel and concrete. It's got to hit the bread and butter level of being just a material that's ready and available to use on ordinary good buildings, not always only something that you can consider on a project where you've got somebody who's enlightened and it's a special project. And we equally need an industry in this country that can both manufacture and deliver it. We need a much wider range of expertise out there we can reach out to and harness, because that's our other problem, really. It's the number of people out there who can really know how to use it and build with it.
Cheers, Nick. Thank you for that. And thank you all panelists. That was a really, really good session. Thank you all for your time. I'm just going to wrap up now. So on Tuesday, the 11th of May, we have our summary white paper webinar. We'd love you all to attend. You can start registering for that. So we're going to launch a white paper in due course. Obviously, again, thank you to our panelists. I'd also just like to thank Laura Wibley, Jess Pennell, Jack Lewis, and obviously Ollie Booth for all their support in putting this panel together. It's been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. I know they had as well. We've had a good laugh along the way, so it's been good. So like I say, we've really enjoyed it. We've going to put a report out on this session, and our white paper will come in due course. And if you'd like to attend that session, then please let us know, and we'd love to see you there. The address is on the screen as ever. So that's it, really. So thank you all. Really good session, and see you all soon. Cheers.
Thanks, Matt.